Today, as we celebrate Dr. King's legacy, we also remember how difficult it was for him amid a nation filled with hate. In 1966, 2 years before he died, Dr. King turned his attention to equal rights for Chicago's poor. It was what Dr. King called Phase 2. It unleashed a torrent of hate. After facing a mob in Chicago, he told reporters, quote, "I think the people of Mississippi should come to Chicago to learn how to hate." Author and historian Rick Perlstein researched 1960s politics. He dug deep into Chicago archives, where he found stark evidence of the backlash and later wrote, quote, "I felt like I was peering into the dark soul of America, to depths I never thought." Much has improved since those times, but we clearly still have more work to do. Joining me now is historian Rick Perlstein. He's also the author of Nixonland, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America. Rick, you've studied the rise of the conservative movement, response to civil rights. Let's go back, Dr. King's time. How did it play out in 1964 after Barry Goldwater's defeat?
Well, after Barry Goldwater's defeat, it was really a triumphant movement for the civil rights movement because out of the Selma martyrs marching across Edmund Pettus Bridge, Lyndon Johnson went before a joint session of Congress. He quoted Martin Luther King, saying, "We shall overcome," and he passed a voting rights bill. And he signed it under the Capitol Rotunda and said the slaves came here in chains, and we've finally broken the last shackles of those fierce and ancient bonds. But 5 days later, the Watts riot immolated the South Central Los Angeles, and that's when we really began to see the backlash.
Now, give us a sense, because a lot of people don't understand that Dr. King was not universally loved while he was alive, and he was one of the most controversial people in the country. The fact is, today, 94% of people see him favorably, but in his lifetime, he was viewed less than 50% favorable by whites and many blacks. Tell us what he faced while he was alive, according to your research.
Yeah, that's what I call the Santa Clausification of Martin Luther King, right? I mean, the reason we honor him is not because he was loved, but because he was hated, and he kept his prophetic witness going nonetheless. In my book, Nixonland, I wrote about what happened when he went to Chicago and marched through neighborhoods merely for the right of people to buy homes that they could afford, according to existing Chicago open housing laws. And while that was going on, a Senate race was happening between a civil rights supporting liberal named Paul Douglas and a Republican who was on the fence named Charles Percy. And the letters that Paul Douglas got from his constituents in the neighborhoods that King marched through were absolutely vituperative and astonishing in their hatred. We white people have taken a lot from the Negro. We have been patient, and now we find ourselves pushed against the wall by groups that feel it is their God-given right to our property, as their ultimate aim, the same as the Soviet Union when all property was collectivized. I want to wake up in the morning and find my milk and newspapers on my doorstep and not find they've been stolen. I want to make sure when I decorate a flat for my tenant that it is kept clean and not torn apart, and the screens and light fixtures haven't been pulled out and sold for a bottle of gin. And most strikingly, in the context of Barack Obama being called Hitler, letter after letter called Martin Luther King a dark-skinned Hitler. It was astonishing to see the vituperation. Yeah.
Now,
I mean, stuff like...
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say something like, today the insufferable arrogance of this character places him on a pedestal as a dark-skinned Hitler. Am I living in Germany under Hitler's rule or in America's?
So they use this analogy even against Dr. King. And one of the things I think that your research reveals that's so important is we don't talk enough about the bias and hostility in the North. Some of us had to face it in Howard Beach and others. We act like this was a Southern problem, and Dr. King had the courage to come north and confront it. But connect for me, we talked about Goldwater, connect quickly for me the conservative elements of today and how it feeds back into those days, and is there a connection?
Yeah, of course, in 1964, Goldwater lost overwhelmingly, and he lost also in these neighborhoods in Chicago overwhelmingly, where there were traditional Democratic Union voters. But in 1966, in the Senate election I talked about, a lot of the letters said, as long as someone like Martin Luther King is marching and taking our property, that was one of the claims, too, that they were taking the property, not wanting to buy the property, and as long as Paul Douglas supports him for Senate, then we're going to vote Republican. And they did. The Republican won that race, and those particular districts went 80% more for the Republicans than they ever had in history.
Wow. Because
the Republicans that year chose as their official platform at a meeting on August 2nd, 1966, to oppose open housing as causing the divisions in America and not healing them.
Rick Perlstein, thanks for your time tonight.